Colleen Feige. Thank you, Julie, for putting the recording on. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Edina, and I want to welcome you all to hear from Dr. Kathryn Pearson, tonight. And just so you know that she's going to tell us what happened in the 2022 election. Now, she also told us that in 2016, 18, and 20, but what happened is different each of those years. So we welcome you, Professor Pearson. It's just great to have you. And I'm sure many on this call have seen her on television. I saw her yesterday on television. She's associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, with a specializing in the Congress and politics, political parties, and so forth. So she's got a wealth of knowledge, which I'm so happy you're willing to share with us. Also, I want to let you know that the presentation is being recorded. You probably saw that on your screen, and we'll be able to put it on our website. We'll have it there by Friday. I like to give us a couple days just in case. And so we'll have it there by Friday. And also, I want to have you put your questions during her presentation. Put your questions in the chat, and we will ask them when she concludes her presentation. And if we have more time after that, we'll accept questions from the audience by raising your hand. So with that, Dr. Pearson, thank you very much, and I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to those in the audience for joining us tonight. I'm going to share my slides, so hopefully this will just take a second to share my screen. Okay, get my slides where they need to go. Okay, great. Well, as prior to talk about the 2022 midterm elections, and here is my summary so far. These are the main points that I will delve into tonight. This was, in many ways, a surprising midterm. We think of midterms as a referendum on the incumbent president. And the incumbent president, Joe Biden, is pretty unpopular, with approval ratings hovering in the low 40s. And voters have been quite concerned about the economy. And so it wasn't just Republicans that were predicting a Republican wave, but political scientists who analyzed the so-called fundamentals, such as presidential approval, popularity, the fact that a Democrat occupies the White House, and public opinion. But nonetheless, the night had a lot of mixed results. As we know just tonight, Republicans have indeed captured majority party control of the U.S. House of Representatives. They're up to 218, with I think 9 races still to call. But a big win for Democrats, maintaining majority party control of the Senate with at least 50 votes. As you know, there will be a runoff in Georgia on December 6th. Partisan polarization remains high, the split ticket voting that we saw notwithstanding. And we did see high turnout in this election. So I'll delve into all of these topics as we go. But to set the stage for the 2022 midterms, I think it's important to remind everyone that not just in Minnesota, but nationwide, we are a polarized and narrowly divided electorate. And actually, the first slide I'm showing you is a bit misleading. So I'm going to show 2 slides here with the partisan identification of the electorate taken from Gallup polls from 1988 to 2021. And the Gallup polls ask the standard political science question: politics as of today, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? And as you can see, the gray lines signify independents, the dark blue are Democrats, and the red are Republican. And if you look at data in 2021, more people identify initially as an independent than either a Republican or a Democrat. But political scientists have done a lot of research on these voters who initially identify themselves as independents. And what we know is that if they answer that they lean toward one of the 2 other parties as a follow-up, in a follow-up question, that they actually vote and participate as partisans. So this figure shows us the results of survey data that say that answer the question, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? And if they say, as of an independent, then the follow-up is, do you lean more to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? And those partisan leaners vote in reliably partisan ways, even though they initially identify themselves as independents. So there is something sort of appealing about identifying yourself as a discerning independent who will study every candidate and every policy issue and make up your own mind, as opposed to be influenced by partisan politics. But the reality is, the vast majority of voters, even those who initially identify as independents, do have some sort of social psychological attachment toward one party or the other. At a minimum, some negative partisanship toward the other party. In addition to partisan identity being quite strong, we also see a lot of negative partisanship where people are, even if they're not that attached to their own party, they're voting against the other party. And we're seeing sort of record rates of this conflict in the electorate between the two parties. And further, what we know about those people who, even when asked the follow-up question, do you lean toward one party or the other, those who maintain that they are pure independents are actually less likely to pay attention to politics and participate in politics. And so those pure independents are not very likely to vote in midterm elections. Midterm election turnout is typically around 20 points lower than general election turnout. So in Minnesota, for example, turnout in 2020 was nearly 80% of eligible voters in Minnesota. That set a record for the United States and for Minnesota. And then this time around in Minnesota, turnout is about 60%. Not the highest state, but close to it, and not the record that Minnesota saw 4 years ago in the midterm at 64%, but again, 20 points lower than the general election, because those pure independents are just less interested in politics and less likely to vote. And then looking at exit poll data from the states that had Senate races, you can see that those who identify as Democrats, 96% of them voted for the Democratic candidate, and 96% of those who identify as a Republican voted for the Republican candidate. Now, this exit poll does not ask the follow-up question. So, we don't know how exactly the leaners voted. See, it's pretty evenly distributed between the two parties. So that is sort of the electoral context. And a lot has been made of the fact that more people than usual split their votes, split their ticket. Party line voting has been on the rise for a couple of decades now, reaching a high water mark 2018 and 2020. But even as there were people who split their tickets, the majority of people still voted straight party line. But turning once to the Senate and Democrats retaining power. So over the past century, the out party, or the party that does not hold the White House, has gained Senate seats in 18 out of 26 midterms, including the one that we just had. And that is because midterm elections are usually a referendum on the president. And in presidential elections, the president's party obviously wins the White House and also tends to pick up some House and Senate seats with the president's coattails. And so there's sort of a surge for the president's party and then a decline 2 years later. Again, add to that the fact the economy is not in great shape, inflation is high, and President Biden isn't very popular. We thought that it would be a tougher election for Democrats than it was. Each party was defending 5 competitive-ish seats. Democrats defending seats in Arizona, Colorado, New Hampshire, Georgia, and Nevada, hanging on to 4 of those seats. And then once again, Georgia is going to a runoff. And then Pennsylvania, and then Republicans were defending an open seat in Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and then incumbents in Florida and Wisconsin. And that Pennsylvania seat, of course, switched to Democrats, with Fetterman winning relatively easily and early on election night. And a lot of analysts, in part myself included, are pointing to former President Trump for some strategic missteps in endorsements of Republican candidates. In a year where the fundamentals favored Republicans, weaker candidates in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, and in Georgia really hindered Republicans' chances of taking over the Senate. We saw that with Masters in Arizona, losing to incumbent Mark Kelly, with Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, and then with the Walker-Warnock runoff, a stronger Republican in Georgia might have carried the day on election night. But you can see that this was not purely an incumbent on President Biden, purely a referendum on the incumbent president. The swing from 2020 is shown here in this great graphic by the New York Times. And typically, when there's a partisan tide in a midterm election, all of the swing goes in one direction. And here, this lack of uniformity in partisan trends really suggests the importance of individual candidates and the campaigns that they ran and local contexts. In Florida, Republicans had a great night. Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio won big margins early in the night, and House Republicans did very well as well. But you can see in other parts of the country, Democrats did much better, suggesting that there was not this one-sided partisan wave that we were expecting. And indeed, this Washington Post headline reflects that. GOP hopes stymied by infighting, Trump, and flawed candidates. Turning to the House, where we're most likely to see wave elections and big gains for the party that does not occupy the White House. So over the past century, the out party, or the party not in the White House, has gained seats in almost every midterm election. The only exceptions are 1934, 1998, and 2002, all years where the newly elected president was very popular. And so, in fact, some of the midterm losses in the president's first midterm cycle have been quite dramatic. Think back to 1994. Democrats lost 52 seats and control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. In 2010, Democrats lost 63 seats and control of the House of Representatives. President Obama referred to it as a shellacking. And in 2018, Republicans lost 40 seats when an unpopular President Trump was really driving turnout and a partisan tide that benefited Democrats. But we really didn't see as much of a tide as expected. Now, as of today, Republicans have gained control of the House of Representatives, but most were predicting that that would happen on election night, as Democrats were defending many more competitive seats, 59 to Republicans' 26. In addition, in this cycle, there were very few swing districts. Going into this midterm cycle after the 2020 elections, there were only 16 congressional districts that split their votes, just an extraordinarily low number, where a congressional district voted for a candidate of one party and then the presidential candidate of another party. It used to be back in the 1980s, there were 100 districts that would vote for a candidate of one party and then vote for a presidential candidate of another party. And today, people just aren't splitting their tickets in the same way. And then redistricting also affected Democrats negatively. Redistricting effects gave an edge to Republicans, though that edge was not as large as the edge that Republicans enjoyed in 2012. And part of the reason for that is, of course, states are in charge of redistricting plans, and there are more instances of unified Republican government where the state legislature and governors are controlled by Republicans than there are Democratic unified government. And then add to that, California, one of the biggest states that enjoys unified Democratic control, does redistricting through an independent commission, which creates a lot of competitive seats instead of a partisan gerrymander, the Democrats. So again, here are election results, a little bit dated now as of this morning, but now it has gotten up to 218, and so that is the majority party vote that Republicans need to control the House. Looking now to the second district in Minnesota. This was the most expensive midterm that Minnesota has seen in terms of spending by the candidates' campaigns, plus spending by outside groups. I'm sure many of you saw negative ad after negative ad. Outside spending was actually more extensive than spending by the campaigns. And of course, can't control the message of the outside groups. It has to be independent, but because it's independent, it can also be unlimited, and outside groups are more likely to run negative ads than any other type of ad. So we saw a lot of in the 2nd district, that rematch between incumbent DFLer Angie Craig, who was challenged for the 2nd time by Republican Tyler Kistner. And given how close this race was expected to be and how much money was spent on it, the margin was actually bigger than expected. And there was a lot made of the legalized marijuana candidate, Paula Overby, who passed away about a month ago. And she still received 3.3% of the vote, but because the margin between Craig and Kistner was sufficiently big, it was not enough to sway the outcome, as many had thought that there might be a possibility of that. Turning now to exit polls, looking once again at exit polls of the states that had Senate races. So these are a representative sample of voters in states with Senate races, which is not the entirety of the US population. But these numbers are consistent with what we saw in 2020, which is to say that women comprised about 52% of the electorate. And there was a gender gap of 11 points. Women preferred the Democratic candidate by 53%, and men preferred the Democratic candidate by 42%. So an 11-point gender gap that made the difference, obviously, for many of these Democratic candidates. So pretty significant gender gap with women preferring Democratic candidates. Also, big differences by race and ethnicity, with white voters who comprised about 73% of the electorate overwhelmingly, with 58% preferring Republican candidates, and voters of color preferring the Democratic candidates. Education has emerged as a big divide in the electorate as well. We really saw that emerge in the 2016 elections. Back in 2012, President Obama split the vote evenly among whites without college degrees. And now whites without college degrees overwhelmingly vote for Republican candidates. And at the same time, whites with college degrees are moving increasingly toward Democratic candidates. It's still pretty evenly divided among college graduates, but an edge toward the Democratic candidates, as you can see here. Age, there are pretty big differences by age, and Democrats sort of benefit from younger voters when they turn out. And younger voters, are those 18 to 29, are less likely to turn out than any other age group. And the drop off between presidential elections and midterm elections is biggest among 18 to 29-year-olds. And that is because of residential mobility. The 18 to 29 group is more residentially mobile, and they're less habituated to voting. And so it is harder to mobilize younger voters in a midterm election. That said, even at a vote turnout rate of 27%, that was less of a drop off than in most midterms. And so those 18 to 29-year-olds preferred Democratic candidates by 63%, and 30 to 44-year-olds, 51 to 47%, and then those 45 and older preferred Republican candidates. And there's been a lot of sort of analysis as to whether or not this is sort of a cohort effect or an aging effect. In other words, will those 18 to 29-year-olds prefer Republican candidates, 20, 40 years from now, or will they stick with Democratic candidates? And the analysis, for the most part, suggests a cohort effect, that most of those 18 to 29-year-olds will stick with the Democratic candidates. And so matter, but the cohort matters more. So if that indeed sticks, that is good news for Democrats. Let's see. One other very important factor in this election that received a lot of attention early on in the summer, but then began is the issue of abortion. With the Dobbs decision on June 24th, Democrats sort of saw an opportunity to energize Democratic voters, including those who weren't necessarily that excited about President Biden. And indeed, the results of the statewide initiative in Kansas that ensured those in Kansas would have access to abortion really gave Democrats sort of a lot of hope that abortion was an issue that would be helpful. And so Democrats ran a lot of ads across the country, sort of priming the issue of abortion, because national polls suggested that voters thought that Democrats did a better job when it came to the issue of abortion and healthcare more generally. And so Democrats wanted to prime that issue, get voters to be thinking about healthcare and abortion when they cast their ballots. And I think that in many ways, this was a strategy for Democrats, even as public opinion polls put the economy, inflation, and sometimes crime ahead of abortion. It was still an issue that received a lot of attention. And this slide from a political scientist at Notre Dame shows the margins in this had the initiatives that protect abortion rights. California, Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, and Vermont. The margin is biggest in Vermont and California, but even in those states, the margin for the initiatives is bigger than the margin for Democratic statewide candidates. So it was an important issue that propelled many voters to vote Democratic, but nonetheless, in that final column where you can see abortion outperforms Democrats, there were still many voters who were voting to support abortion rights, and then for Republican candidates with a different view of abortion rights at the top of the ticket. So it was a concern to voters, but not necessarily at the top of the list for all voters. In Minnesota, much to analysts and really everyone's surprise, the DFL won the trifecta, full control of state government. Governor Walz was pretty consistently, with one exception, leading in the polls. So that was less of a surprise. But I think most analysts projected that Republicans would maintain party control of the state Senate, and whether or not the DFL would maintain control of the state House was really up for grabs. But indeed, on election night, it was too close to call, but by the next day, the DFL had won full control with a 1-vote margin in the Senate and a very narrow margin in the House. So there's not a lot of room for error, but certainly Democrats at the state Capitol have met and began planning for the legislative session. This headline for the Star Tribune sort of captures, I think, the sentiments of the DFL. Minnesota DFLers credit Roe v. Wade, anxiety over democracy for control. And that anxiety over democracy is something that really showed up a lot during the campaign, not so much in polls, but in sort of the contest between candidates who denied the results of the 2020 election and those who did not. We saw that in the Minnesota Secretary of State race. But first, I'll turn to the governor race. And there again, Tim Walz and Peggy Flanagan won a second term over GOP challenger Scott Jensen and Matt Burke. And the margin was perhaps bigger than people expected in a year where the fundamentals, the economy, the party in the White House favored Republicans. But nonetheless, Walz was able to win re-election. Incumbent governors win usually about 75% of the time, and win with a narrower margin than in 2018, where he won by 11 points, but nonetheless, a pretty substantial margin when all was said and done. But support for Walz is really geographically concentrated in the metro area, in Duluth, to some extent, though on the Iron Range, and then in Rochester and Mankato. And so most geographically, as you can see, is red, with sort of some deeper pockets than others. But it really is quite a geographically divided state. And if you think about the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Coalition, that coalition has really shifted over the last 20 years. The western part of the state, which is encompassed by Minnesota's 7th congressional district, really votes very Republican. Michelle Fischbach, of course, won overwhelmingly. She defeated longtime incumbent Colin Peterson 2 years ago in a district that went 20% for Trump. And so that section of the state, which really relies on agriculture, that really, previously was part of the farmer part of the DFL coalition, has really gone Republican. And then in terms of the labor part, thinking about the Iron Range, mining, there are still some shades of blue, but most of the legislators from northern Minnesota are now Republicans. And so there have been some changes in the electoral margins from different parts of the state. And this slide from David Montgomery that is from 2002 to 2022 shows the sort of margin of votes for the DFL under the even line and the margin of votes for Republicans over the line. So for example, here in 2020, you can see that in 2020, this would have been Biden got more than 300,000 more votes in Hennepin County than Trump did. And so these big margins in Hennepin County really help statewide candidates, DFL statewide candidates in Minnesota, Ramsey County as well. And then the suburbs, which used to provide excess votes for Republican candidates, switched between 2016 and 2018, and now provide more votes for the DFL than they do for Republicans at the top of the ticket. And then you can see the margins for Republican candidates in greater Minnesota have increased over the years, and the exurbs have been relatively consistent. Turnout was down in part of the state, that often goes to Republican. So that was pretty consequential, and then up in a few areas in the state, including areas that vote DFL, which was helpful for statewide candidates. In the Secretary of State, Steve Simon won by the biggest margin of any statewide candidate in 2022. And this was not the case 4 years ago. His margin of victory was much narrower than Governor Walz's. And I really sort of chalk this up to the Secretary of State having a much more visible role since 2020, and running against a candidate who would not say that the results of the 2020 election were legitimate. So I think that really, support for the small d democratic values of legitimate elections really resonated with voters. Simon won the biggest margin statewide. The Attorney General's race was much more narrow, with Ellison getting a margin of 50.4 to Jim Schultz's 49.6, a much more competitive race. And then the most competitive race being DFL State Auditor Julie Blaha's re-election by only 3 percentage points. So very narrow. Across the country, many of the governor's races were quite competitive, and the Democrats, not the DFL, actually made a strong showing on election night, again, despite the fundamentals that favored Republican candidates. So the Arizona race has been called. Now it was leaning for Hobbs over an election denier, Carrie Lake, and so that was quite significant. And Minnesota is not the only state that switched to unified Democratic Party control. That also in Maryland and Michigan and Maine as well. As I said, turnout in 2022 went down in Minnesota from a record of 64% to a strong showing of 60%, but in all of the states in yellow, actually turnout went up. And not surprisingly, some of those states were states with very competitive statewide races. Not all of them, but some of them. Again, youth turnout was the second highest in history, but still only at 27%. Certainly one outcome of the 2022 midterms was that it was a bad night for former President Trump. Talked about, was 2022 a referendum on President Biden, as most midterms are, and to some extent it was. Republicans took control of the House, but it was also a referendum on many of the candidates that were endorsed early on and supported by former President Trump. And so this line from the Washington Post sort of encapsulates the narrative that came out of that. A red wave of criticism crashes into Donald Trump after midterm losses. And this figure that was in the Washington Post actually shows the candidates that perform below expectation compared to above expectation in terms of the margin expected for the Republican win. And those candidates that were endorsed by Trump are those in sort of yellow orange. And you can see many more of them are below expectation than the candidates in gray. And the most prominent examples of that, of course, are the Pennsylvania governor's race, the Pennsylvania Senate race, Arizona. So in Trump's endorsed candidate in Ohio, J.D. Vance, did win. But these other critical races where Trump actually played a pretty big role in the primary and then in the campaign, really did not make it a good night for him. And then his rival, one of his rivals, Governor Ron DeSantis, of course, won early, and Florida was a state that went early and strongly for Republicans. Election deniers in general do particularly well in secretaries of states races, but nonetheless, more than 180 180 members were either reelected or newly elected to the House of Representatives that have not said that the 2020 election was legitimate. Several lost in their race for the US Senate, but 3 new senators were elected who said that the 2020 was stolen. And then once again, sort of looking at the secretaries of state, most of them lost, many lost for governor and attorney general as well. But I think significantly, those candidates who lost have said that the 2020 election was not legitimate, did concede. And so that was certainly something that was good news for the night, is the concessions that came from candidates who were not willing to concede that 2020 was a legitimate election. Briefly, polls, despite sort of rumblings to the contrary, actually did pretty well in 2022, better than the political science models that predicted a big Republican wave because of Biden's low approval ratings and a poor economy. So there was actually a little bit of a Republican polling bias, but in general, the polls were actually pretty accurate in 2020. Election administration did pretty well overall as well. There were a few hiccups, such as Maricopa County, but even though get their ballots sort of processed where they were able to be scanned during the day and counted. And just this group does not need reminding of how important volunteer election judges are and all the people who volunteer to work at the polls, because election administration is highly decentralized with over 8,000 jurisdictions across 50 states and DC, and most election administration offices have fewer than 5 staff. Errors happen, but they rarely indicate systemic problems or bad actors. And 2022 had some hiccups, but for the most part, they were remedied. There's still some investigation into some errors in Mississippi, but I don't think those caused any changes in the outcome. But in general, 2022 was very smooth in terms of election administration. The number of women in Congress is either staying stable or going down by 1. 2018 was a year that saw a record number of women candidates. 2020 was a year that saw a record number of women candidates and record increases in Congress. And 2022 was sort of a status quo year when it comes to women's candidacies and electing women, which, for those that sort of see constant progress, having a plateau year is not great news. But nonetheless, at least it looks like a setback according to the Center for American Women in Politics, but I think once all of the races are called, the number of women in Congress will essentially be the same in the next Congress as it is now. Good news in terms of women governors, the number has gone from 9 to 12, 8 Democrats and 4 Republicans, setting a record for the number of women governors across the country. And there were some definite notables in terms of those election night. So Vermont sent its first woman to Congress, and Vermont is the last state to send a woman to Congress for the first time. But before we get too cranky about Vermont, I think it's important to note it only has 1 representative. So it's easier for a state like California to send, dozens of women, which it has, to Congress. And Becca Balint is also the first openly gay person to represent Vermont. Katie Britt is the first woman elected to the Senate from Alabama. So there are many other notables as well, but that was worth pointing out. Looking toward the 118th Congress, Democrats will say that the Democratic majority in the Senate is absolutely critical for President Biden's nominees. There's still a lot of judicial nominees that he wants to get through, and having the ability to get them through the Judiciary Committee, even if it's a time they need a discharge petition if they don't get the 51st vote, and getting them to the Senate floor, where worst case scenario, the vice president breaks a tie, is really important to President. But divided government will lead to gridlock on a lot of major policy issues, in which we actually saw a lot of legislative action for the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, where the Congress and Biden work closely together to pass a lot of legislation, but it will be much more challenging for Democrats in the next 2 years. The Congress pass 12 annual appropriations bills, a debt ceiling increase. I think that will pose a challenge. Go back to the drawing board with those appropriations bills several times, and work out some bipartisan deals. And it remains to be seen whether or not Speaker-elect Kevin McCarthy will be able to keep enough of his members together. Speaker Pelosi has done a remarkable job of keeping the very narrow Democratic majority together in the House of Representatives. And I think Speaker McCarthy will face some challenges, just as his predecessors, Paul Ryan and John Boehner, did in keeping the Freedom Caucus members on board with some compromises they'll need to work out with Democrats. And finally, my last slide of the night is looking toward 2024. Now, generally, midterm elections actually don't tell us that much about the election to come in 2 years. So 1994, terrible year for Democrats, historically bad. Democrats lose party control of Congress for the first time in 40 years, yet 2 years later, President Clinton is reelected pretty easily. Similar story in 2010. Terrible midterm for President Obama, reelected in 2012 relatively easily. 2018, different story, bad midterm for Trump, and then a very competitive race in 2020. But 2024, I think, is different because of former President Trump. The Republican nominating contest began on yesterday, with former President Trump's announcement and the fact that he filed with the Federal Election Commission to run for president again in 2024. And he begins as the frontrunner. There's sort of no way around that, even as a lot of Republicans are beginning to voice some concerns and beginning some hand-wringing. But it's the voters and delegates, it's the voters in primaries and caucuses that determine the delegates, not the party leaders. And so it really remains to be seen the extent to which voters in primaries and caucuses will be enthusiastic about another Trump bid for the White House. But again, his candidates fared poorly in 2022. And so that has given some Republican leaders more latitude to openly be critical. I think it'll be very interesting in the coming days and weeks to see if Republicans consolidate around another candidate, because the more Republican candidates who run, the easier it will be for Trump to get the nomination. But if there's sort of one alternative that Republicans consolidate around, so it's, the Trump candidate versus the anti-Trump candidate, I think that will make things more challenging for Trump. Biden has said he will decide whether or not he's running for re-election in early 2023, but all signs thus far point to yes. And I think Trump has gotten into the race, I think that only increases the likelihood that Biden will run for re-election as the incumbent president. And so I was going to go about 40 minutes and it's 7:40. So I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Pearson. I do have a couple of questions that are in the chat, which I would love to pose to you, and I encourage other people to drop a question in the chat, or if you would prefer, we can, if you raise your hand, we can call on you. Our first question from Lonnie. Do you have any thoughts about how the runoff in Georgia may go?
So great question. And I should preface this by saying that 2 years ago, when there was a runoff in Georgia, I predicted that it would be very challenging for Democrats to win in a runoff, because typically Republicans are more likely to show up to vote in a special election or a runoff, all else equal. But clearly Georgia is now a swing state. For decades, it was solidly Democratic, then it was solidly Republican, and now we're in a situation where Georgia's a swing state, and so voter mobilization is obviously key here. Now, Warnock is a stronger candidate. I mean, Walker obviously has a lot of problems as a candidate, but if this is just about voting for party in the Senate, that, makes it more complicated because Georgia's so evenly divided. The message is a little trickier for Democrats now that they have 50 seats. So instead of saying, this is a vote about party control of the Senate, this is a vote about getting 51 votes in the Senate, which is easier to manage as a party than 50 votes. And so it's not quite the same, doesn't quite have the same ring to it. The other thing that Democrats are thinking about is that it would be a lot easier to have a majority of 51 than 50, because even with that 50-50 majority that Democrats have, Democrats chair the committees for sharing agreement. So there are equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans on the committees. So if a committee is divided, they need a discharge petition, and it's just a little more onerous. It still works, but it's more onerous. But 2 years from now, Democrats are structurally disadvantaged going into the Senate races. The 34 Senate races that will happen in 2024, about twice as many Democrats are vulnerable than Republicans. And so Democrats also really want to keep this seat, knowing that the next cycle is going to be tough for Democrats. A lot of Democrats who were elected in 2018, that wave year for Democrats, will be facing a tough reelection. So all this to say is, both parties will pour millions and millions of dollars into this race. And if I had to guess, I would say Warnock would win, but I really don't hold me to that. It all depends on who turns out.
Thank you. Another question popping up. They're all coming in now. What do you think about the challenge to Mitch McConnell as minority leader in the Senate? Granted, he won.
Yeah, I think the challenge came from Rick Scott from Florida. I think it is very interesting. I think it was a little bit surprising. And McConnell is more vulnerable. Republicans didn't become the majority party, and there was that possibility. But I think it really, I think it shows that McConnell is going to have a tough time as leader in the Senate. In many ways, it's actually easier to be the minority leader, because when you're the minority leader, all you're doing is blocking things. So this actually would have been more problematic for him if he was the majority leader and trying to broker deals and keep conservatives happy. But I think it shows that if Democrats do retake the majority 2 years from now, that McConnell cannot assume he's going to be the leader. I think it shows that there are some senators dissatisfied with his leadership, how he represents the party, and that some Republicans are seeking sort of a new generation of leaders.
Thank you. Our next question, were Blaha's two cannabis opponents false flag Republicans?
Yeah, that is possible. I actually don't know enough about it to know, but it is certainly the case that in elections that happens, because the idea is that since DFL candidates tend to be of legalizing marijuana, having a third marijuana candidate on the ballot would take more votes away from Democrats than from Republicans. So we saw that, for example, in Angie Craig's race 2 years ago, where the candidate actually sort of admitted that the Republican Party had contacted him. So I don't know particular. Strategically, the thought is that it would be more harmful. My question is, well, we can't know that for sure. Could it be that that those voters would have just, not voted in that race? because they didn't really have a preference voting for the top of the ticket. But it certainly, helps explain why, neither of the candidates obviously got to 50%.
Mhm. Okay. What do you think? Do you think Joe Manchin will change parties?
I don't. I think if he was going to do that, that would have happened before. I think that he enjoys a lot of power as a Democrat whose vote they need. And he has definitely been willing to exert that power. Now, if Warnock wins, maybe his power is lessened a little bit because they don't, they can afford to lose him and still have Harris break the tie. But he's enjoyed a lot of power in the last 2 years. And I think if he changed parties, it wouldn't be like, oh, now everyone loves him. It would be like, no one likes him. And that would not be good as he goes into a re-election.
What are your thoughts about Nancy Pelosi continuing as minority leader in the House?
Yeah, so first, Pelosi is the most skilled speaker since Joe Cannon in the early 1900s at keeping the party together. I mean, and that has been obvious for the last 4 years, and it will be obvious, even more obvious, once McCarthy tried to keep his similar margin of majority party members together and have much more trouble than Pelosi did. I mean, she really did a masterful job of keeping sort of the more moderate Democrats and the squad and everyone on the same page. And she's also just a brilliant strategist. Not a great public speaker. And so Democrats don't love that. And then I think she just does not appeal to younger Democrats. I mean, my students just see her as sort of an entrenched institutionalist instead of the, progressive Democrat that she started out as, in the early days at the beginning of her career. And so I suspect that she will retire. I think if Democrats had somehow hung on to the majority, she would continue to be speaker. But I think, she's been speaker, then minority party leader, then speaker. That, does she really want to go back to this being in the minority again? If Trump were president and, it was a minority leader challenging a president of another party, I think she'd stay. But with Biden as president and Democrats in the minority, I suspect that she will retire. But I don't know, who knows? I've been wrong so many times.
Jane has her hand up. So Jane, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and pose your question.
This is actually Paul, Jane's husband, but my question has to do with the issue of the polls allegedly not being terribly accurate. I heard what you said about they were more accurate than a lot of people have thought, and I've heard several people say that, and I tend to agree with it. But my issue has to do with the question of pundits versus polls. It's one thing for a poll to say X% for this guy and Y% for that guy, but then there's people down track who begin to interpret that, and they will look at those raw numbers and they'll say, looks like the Democrats are worried. Looks like the Republicans are going to have a wave. And then that punditry echo chamber grows a life greater than the poll numbers themselves. Is that an accurate assumption?
Yeah, in many ways, yes, it is. And one thing that people never talk about because it's hard to explain and wonky is the margin of error. So, someone can be ahead by a couple points in the poll, but it's really actually within the margin of error. So it's a statistical tie. And that nuance always gets lost. But predicting the red wave from political scientists, it was not based on polls. The analyst, it was, but political scientists look at sort of the number of seats that are competitive to begin with, the state of the economy, and the president's approval rating, and put that into a regression model without knowing anything about polls to make predictions about waves. And so, those are the so-called fundamentals: which party's in the White House, what that president's approval rating is, and the state of the economy. And on that basis, political scientists predicted a red wave. Using the polls to sort of say there's going to be a red wave is something a lot of analysts did. And they weren't really attentive to the margin of error and the most basic sort of, reality that polls are a snapshot in time. And there are a lot of at least, some undecided voters in polls. And if these undecided voters are indeed voters, they're probably going to break one way or the other when they actually get to the ballot box. And then I think for many people, 2018, 2010, and 1994 really also informed a lot of these predictions, thinking that, this is a year that looks like those years, when in reality, it didn't look like those years after all.
Thank you.
Another question from Nancy. Her question is, what are your thoughts about who may challenge Biden in 2024?
Such a great question. I think if Biden announces in January that he is running for re-election, I don't think anyone challenges him. I could be wrong, but I think if he announces pretty early, and especially given that Trump is running, I think he's the Democratic nominee with maybe sort of token opposition, someone who would not be a real viable challenger. Yeah, I think that, he has some liabilities, but in terms of legislative success, he has been an incredibly good president. He's not a great speaker, doesn't have a lot of press conferences, you sort of worry about what he's going to say. I think that Democrats have a lot of reasons to stick with him. Some reasons not to, but more reasons to stick with him than not. If he doesn't run for re-election, I think that it's going to be a very messy nominating contest with Democrats. No clear front runner, a strong contender, but she's not necessarily a front runner, and that would cause a lot of strife within the Democratic Party. Which is another reason why I think that if Biden announces that he's running, that people will be like, okay, this makes our decision easy. And I do think he will keep Harris. I saw that question in the chat. I do think he will keep Harris. She has a hard job, and for whatever reason, I don't know, the portfolio that she's been given is hard, but I think that there are a lot of good reasons to keep her, and I think that there's not a good reason to take her off the ticket.
Any other thoughts, any other comments or questions from the audience? Again, please feel free to raise your hand or turn your mic on and pose a question.
Hi. It looked, when you flashed through the things in Minnesota, I think it was, and looked at the minority voting, I couldn't quite see down, but it looked like the Native American went more Republican than the Hispanic and the African American vote. And I didn't know if that was the case or if I just missed that in your
So in the exit polls.
Maybe that was the slide it was in.
Okay, because the exit polls do not include Minnesota because Minnesota did not have a Senate race. So the exit polls are better in a presidential year because it's from all 50 states, but exit polls in a midterm are only from the 34 states that have a Senate race. So Minnesota was actually not in the exit polls, unfortunately. And Native Americans tend to be Democratic voters. But interestingly, sort of Native Americans in Minnesota now have more political power because they're more highly concentrated in one congressional district, but it's still nonetheless a Republican congressional district. So it'll be interesting to see if the consolidation sort of means more attentiveness legislatively, but it did not translate into, support for a Democratic candidate.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Questions? Oh, good.
I have a question. I know there's quite a bit of voter suppression everywhere, but especially in Georgia, they really tightened it up after 2020. And with this runoff, I've heard that the souls to the polls on Saturday is outlawed because of a Robert E. Lee holiday the day before and drop boxes in the black areas. So I'm just wondering, they've got to be challenged legally, but it doesn't seem like it changes very much. And the same with a lot of partisan gerrymandering in Florida. Very, very, I think DeSantis had his own maps, but nothing happened legally. So I just wanted you to comment on that.
Right. Well, and to the extent that there are legal challenges, the Supreme Court has sort of said, we're just not going to get involved in gerrymandering, and we're going to let these partisan gerrymanders fly. And so yes, that is definitely a problem. And this is something that we're seeing in policy making more generally. So with, up until recently, a lot of gridlock at the federal level, and on voting rights gridlock because of the filibuster, we see states going in two different directions. So states that have unified Democratic control are actually moving in a direction to remove barriers to voting. So more and more states than ever have moved to same-day registration. Minnesota used to be one of 5 states, and there are more than a dozen. And so, some states are moving in one direction, and then states that have Republican trifectas are moving in the opposite direction by really restricting voting rights and sort of limiting access. And there are legal challenges, but it really just shows the importance of federalism and how much control individual states have over people's right to vote in federal elections and sort of their rights as citizens. And I suspect that, there'll be a lot of attention on Georgia. And so there'll be a lot of mobilization efforts to get around some of these barriers, and also more attention to some of these barriers. But you're right, Georgia has definitely moved in a more restrictive direction in recent years. And I think we'll see more evidence of that in this election.
Thank you.
So, Julie, so speaking of the importance of federalism, what are your thoughts on the case that's going to come before the Supreme Court that may give control over elections to state legislatures and even rule out the role of state courts?
I mean, I am concerned about that case. I don't see how this legal theory could fly, but it is a very conservative Supreme Court, as you all know, 6-3 conservative majority. And so at this point, after Dobbs, I would say nothing would really surprise me, but that would have some pretty extreme consequences in some states. So I have no prediction about the outcome, but it is something I'm concerned about and following.
Other questions?
So there's no other questions, Julie?
Not right now. I'm trying to do the Minnesota thing and or not do the Minnesota thing and pause and not fill in the silence with my words. So sometimes if we do that, other people, it gives it an opportunity to think a little bit more.
I have another question. I had
Good.
heard that the voter turnout in Milwaukee was lower than expected, and giving Mandela Barnes and how important Milwaukee is to him. And I also heard there was some restrictive voting there. So I don't know what you've heard, but it seems like that was such a key area for him to possibly.
Oh, it was such a key area. Right. And so was that, sort of lack of mobilization? Did the parties not do a good job, or did the, Democratic Party not do a good job in the campaigns, or was that about voter suppression or some combination or midterm drop off? I think more analysis needs to be done, but the Wisconsin results were, talk about a narrowly divided state, conservative Republican wins Johnson in the Senate race, and then, a Democrat Evers wins in the governor's race. So those are, two very divergent results, both statewide elections. And sort of just like Minnesota, where the metro is key for Democratic candidates, Milwaukee is obviously very important. Milwaukee and Madison for Democratic candidates in Wisconsin.
And I have a question. What do you think about parties giving money to the other party's candidates to kind of hope that the worst candidates would be in the primary? What do you think about that going forward?
Right. I mean, we saw the ads for the extreme candidates, and it's not illegal. Is it the party's best use of their resources? I mean, they think they're behaving strategically. I assume they've done some polling that suggests in a general election they'd rather face the more extreme candidate. But there's a danger in a wave election. Sort of if it favors one party, that party's extreme candidate can win. So if I were a party making those decisions, it is not something that I would do. But they obviously were trying to think strategically about it. But if voters are turned off by that, I don't really blame them.
And I think maybe contributors to the party are
Right.
turned off
Right.
as well.
Right. The party's using my money to, and the party's defense in that case was, oh, but this is still help. This would be the general election ad. We would say the same thing. Well, no, not really. It's still an ad in support of that candidate. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, you understand why parties spend so much more money on the competitive races and all but ignore the other ones. But then you think, what if Democrats spent any money in Lauren Boebert's district? Could the Democrat have won? So the fact that so much money goes to so few races really should have the parties be thinking a little bit more broadly, maybe in 2024.
Karen from St. Cloud, the League of Women Voters. Welcome, Karen. What's your
Thank you.
question?
I had read that recently and I hadn't realized that the Democrats were doing that. And I think I read $19 million. But 10 years ago, I would have been horrified. And I think most of the time, Democrats are thinking more morally. But I will tell you today that I don't have a problem with that at all, considering what has been going on the last 10 years. I think that perhaps strategically it is necessary, at least in the short run. Dr. Pearson, what would you say?
I mean, obviously it was made as a strategic decision, was sort of the goal of winning that seat by any legal, I mean, it's not illegal, any legal means necessary. And in some ways, I sort of also put it in the same category as, all of the negative ads coming from these outside groups that, they distort things, and both parties do it. And so that is to some extent the world that we're living in, and both trying to win and to be strategic about it.
We have a question from David and Sue.
Yeah, I noticed that the backside of our ballot was judges, right? And they were all unopposed, but it was like, I don't know, 60 of them or something like that. Is there a better way to do that, or is there any sense in that?
So great question. And, most of those judges are unopposed, but most, those judges are not initially selected by voters. They have to get reelected by voters, but they are initially selected by the governor. And because of the way that people sort of retire at a time there's not an election, once there is an election, people have to appear on the ballot. And so there still is a selection mechanism that occurs that happens from the governor's office, that it's not a primary, or, it's not, the initial process is not an election. Because, right, otherwise, on earth are voters going to make these decisions? None of these judges are running campaigns. We don't know anything about them. In fact, campaign rules for these judges' races are very different. And so, in very few cases is there a challenger. And I guess if a judge, is making very controversial rulings, someone might try to start publicizing that and run. But for the most part, these judges are selected by the governor, which means that, the governor's advisors who are familiar with their credentials are reviewing all of these applications. But then why put them on the ballot?
May I add to that, just because there's a panel of lawyers throughout the state who are selected. It's a little bit of a competitive process, and that panel actually advises the governor on candidates for judges. And that's a process that's been used, oh my gosh, at least for the last 20 years, I think, in Minnesota. And my concern about not voting, so I mark every judge on every ballot, because my concern is if it's perceived in Minnesota that there is not interest in confirming these choices that were made, that we could end up in a situation that some states have gotten into where people think it's going to be a cheap race to take on, an inexpensive race to take on, and that it becomes a stealth way to get into government because it's perceived again as lacking interest.
That's a really great point.
Another question in the chat: how important was the college vote in Wisconsin and Michigan?
Very important. Definitely in a close election, every vote matters, and big mobilization on. I'm sure some of you saw the same news coverage as I did of college students waiting in very, very, very long lines. And even though, again, turnout among 18 to 29-year-olds is lower than every other age group, it is critically important for Democratic candidates because the margins are so disproportionately Democratic, and these are competitive statewide elections. So very important.
And another important question here: do you see any chance of getting dark money out of elections?
Not with this current Supreme Court that has ruled over and over again that, money is expression and protected by the First Amendment, and sort of anyone, corporations, individuals can make unlimited independent contributions. And then the dark money specifically, the 501c money. I mean, you could imagine a Democratic Congress with 60 Democratic senators putting in stricter rules about what qualifies as a political organization and what the threshold is to sort of control some of the dark money, because the dark money is from 501c4s whose primary purpose is not political, except their primary purpose is political because primary purpose is never defined. So Congress could act to define it in some way, but without 60 votes in the Senate, Democrats can't do that. I don't even know that every Democratic senator would support that. So no, I don't see the Supreme Court or Congress making any changes that would restrict dark money, sadly.
I have a question about New York. I heard the Democrats kind of made a mess of the redistricting maps, and they didn't fight back, and we lost several competitive, maybe 4 seats. I think Sean Patrick Maloney lost his seat, and he was the head of the whatever it is, DCC. So I don't know if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, no, that is exactly what happened. Right. So Sean Patrick Mahoney was the head of the DCCC, in charge of all of the Democratic House races, and then he lost. And Democrats did not push back on redistricting. The court did not do them any favors. And then the other problem was that, Democrats were running against each other. And for the most part, they, like Carolyn Maloney and Jerry in the same district, there wasn't much they could do, but there were some cases where Democrats could have made other choices about which districts to run in that might have helped as well. Yeah, so New York was a disaster for Democrats. I mean, a disaster because the margins are so low. So you take a state like New York, which had the potential to be better for Democrats, and then a state like California, which can't do a partisan gerrymander. And then there are many Republican states that, don't do redistricting in the state level. And so they do these pretty dramatic partisan gerrymanders. I mean, both parties do partisan gerrymanders. It's just, which parties are able.
This is Colleen. I just have one comment. The Maryland, they had redistricted there a few years ago. I don't remember. I don't know exactly when, but I thought the governorship in Maryland, I thought the transition, well, it's not completed yet, but the incumbent and not the incumbent, he wasn't running, but the person that replaced him, I thought they were very congenial. That's the sort of thing we need to see more of in this country. You know, I forget the new guy's name and the other one as well, but I just thought it was nice to see them working together.
Yeah. Hogan and Moore. Yeah. Like,
Exactly.
And Moore is the first governor of Maryland
Yeah.
and the only Black governor right now.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
That was just that. I thought Maryland was kind of a nice, and Hogan's always been quite reasonable in his approach to everything. Yeah.
Very much so. Very much
yeah.
so. Yeah, no, I agree.
Any other questions in the chat or online?
Nothing in the chat.
And nobody's hand up that you can see or Journey can see. Well, then I guess, I see some people.
Barb Berry just raised a hand.
Okay, Barb, go ahead.
Well, Senator Grassley, I think, just got reelected, and isn't he like 89 or something? And do you think there will ever be age limits on anything? I mean, I suppose that could be ageism, but
so the average age, it is true that the average age of the senators is continuing to rise. I can't remember there was an interesting comparison I read recently, but it is definitely to rise. But no, I do not think that senators will ever impose age limits on themselves, though, definitely, I mean, Dianne Feinstein is under tremendous pressure to retire. And, we'll see what happens with that. And yeah, I think, voters in primaries may impose an age limit at some point, but that did not happen to Grassley, and it didn't happen to Feinstein last time around. So I don't think that's something that the Congress would pass, because I don't think people want to offend colleagues or impose an age limit upon themselves. But in some cases, voters may act to do so.
Well, last call for questions.
I have one
Michael
more
Stoney.
question, and this is, we're getting into more kind of financial issues, but what about the move in Congress to limit financial trading, or to end financial trading?
Yeah, that gained a lot of traction for a while there, and then sort of midterm elections took over and the issue went away. I had actually thought that Congress passed that and Biden went to law. That has not happened. So I would say stay tuned on that. It won't happen in the next Congress, but will it happen in this lame duck session? Maybe. The fact that it didn't happen before the midterms makes me skeptical, but the momentum was such that I was hopeful that would happen. But yeah, a little less hopeful now.
It will be interesting to see how much gets done in the lame duck session, because same-sex marriage is something going on today. So hopefully there's a lot gets taken care of during the lame duck session.
Right, exactly. With Democrats still controlling the House, I mean, I think they really want to get the same-sex marriage bill through the Senate, and then also raising the debt ceiling. Just sort of take that issue off the table sooner rather than later, and getting a year-long continuing appropriations bill.
And how common is it to have good ideas, good common sense legislation that I think probably has wide support and not confined to one party? How common is it to have that get almost to the finish line before an election and then kind of disappear?
Well, it certainly happened in St. Paul. I mean, the Republicans had worked out this grand compromise of spending and taxes with $9 billion, and then that disappeared. And I think Republicans thought that strategically would go their way in the sense that they would be able to shape it, have more influence on the bill after the elections. So that was a calculation, because now they'll have less say in it. Obviously, I think it depends on the circumstances, but I think that, if there's a bipartisan sentiment in the Senate with at least 60 votes, most of these bills need 60 votes, then I think they'll get it done, because there's just no way a Republican controlled would pass the same-sex marriage bill or the limits on financial trading. So maybe.
Well, let
We'll
me,
throw it over to you, Colleen. Thank you so much.
oh, thank you, Julie and Joni, and especially to you, Professor Pearson. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And we are so happy to be able to share it with other league members, other leagues, members of other leagues, and with our members as well. So we appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing you maybe in 2024, we hope.
Well, thank you for all the great questions. I really appreciated your questions.
Okay, thank you so much. And everyone, have a very happy Thanksgiving and enjoy this winter weather that we're having, or at least put up with the winter weather that we're having. So thank you all and have a good evening, okay?